Hello, I'm Evan with New Life for Old Bikes. In today's episode, we're going to work on Charlotte's 1969 Schwinn Collegiate. Charlotte's parents bought her this bike when she went off to college. This was her basic transportation, and we're going to make it safe and reliable once again. What we're going to do today is we're going to tear it completely down, wax the frame, service all the bearings, and we're replacing the shifter cable. This has been replaced at one point and it's too short. We're going to be replacing the chain, the brake pads, the tires, tubes, and rim strips. Just a quick note here. If you're working on an older Schwinn bicycle, the tire size is not standard. They're 20-inch as well as they're 26-inch. The wheels are actually a half-inch larger than most European and Japanese bicycles of the same period. Before starting on this bike, 2 days ago, I sprayed penetrating oil on all the fasteners. I wanted to make sure that this thing would come apart very easily. I don't want to break anything because, well, needless to say, it's going to be kind of hard to find parts for a 1969 Schwinn Collegiate. Oops. On pedals, the left side or non-drive side of the bike turns left to tighten, so we need to turn it right to loosen. This requires a very narrow wrench to fit in. My goodness, that's stiff. Next, I'm going to soak all the parts in mineral spirits. They can be soaking while I'm cleaning the frame and waxing it. A little steel wool takes the minor surface rust right off. I use 4/0, that way it doesn't scratch the finish. All bearing races get scrubbed down with a little mineral spirits to get out the old grease. The best way I've found to take surface rust off of chrome-plated parts is with 4/0 or 4/0 steel wool. You can also use a piece of wrinkled up aluminum foil. It does a beautiful job at cleaning this up. And needless to say, it doesn't scratch the finish. Next, we're using a brass brush to clean the ridges on the chrome. The brass brush won't scratch the finish like a steel brush would. In the next step, we're going to remove the freewheel from the hub on the back wheel of the bike. It requires a specific spline tool that matches up with the splines on the inside of the freewheel. We simply put it in and turn it. Unfortunately, this particular one is French made and requires a specific tool that I don't have, so I had a friend remove this for me. Oh my, is that crunchy. Someone changed the tube on the front tire at one point and actually folded it over because it was too long. In order to remove these dings from the back of the fender, I'll be using a rubber mallet and a block of wood. I went over all the surface rusted areas with a wire brush. I then cleaned it with lacquer thinner. At this point, I'm going over it with a rust converter, and with any luck, it won't come back. I'm doing exactly the same thing with the inside of the fenders. Now that your bike is disassembled, put a nice thick coat of wax on it. You don't know when the next time is you'll be taking it apart. Once we have all the parts waxed, we'll be able to start our reassembly. Once you've removed the freewheel from the bike, soak it in some mineral spirits. It should clean up very easily now. Normally, I would completely disassemble this, but unfortunately it's froze up and I can't get it apart. The bearings, however, are running very smooth, so what I'll be doing is simply cleaning everything and pouring some oil through it. A piece of string with little mineral spirits on it does a real good job of cleaning the goo out from between the gears. When lubricating your freewheel, use a paraffin-based oil. You want to pour it through the top, and when it starts coming through the bottom and it's nice and clean, you're done. There we go. Looks clean, and it runs smoothly. Regardless of whether you're working on a front wheel or a back wheel, take note of how many spacers are on the axle and on which side. Take note of how many bearings came out of each side and make sure and clean them up thoroughly in mineral spirits. When putting this back together, make sure you use a waterproof grease. When tightening the bearings, make sure there's no slop, but also make sure they're not binding at all. Sometimes it takes a couple of times to get it right. That feels real good. Before I install the chain guard or the Freewheel, I'm going to go ahead and clean up that chain guard. I've got a little bit of steel wool and some wax to clean that up with. Again, I'm using 4/0 steel wool or 4/0. This way it won't damage the finish on the chrome. Once we've serviced our wheel bearings and cleaned our chain guard, we're going to put that back on. Next, we need to wipe a thin film of grease on the threads for the Freewheel. This is to prevent it from seizing up in the future. Don't have to worry about tightening this up very much, because when you pedal, it turns clockwise and will tighten as you pedal. Before installing a new tire on this wheel, I have to install a rim strip. This piece of rubber protects the tube from the end of the spokes. Make sure that the hole lines up for the valve stem. When you're installing the tire, if it has a logo on it, put it directly over the valve stem hole. That way it's easy to find the valve stem. Add a little bit of air to the tube just so it holds shape. It makes it easier to install. go. If you need to see a more detailed video on changing tires, if you would, just look up New Life for Old Bikes, Installing New Tires. And I give a very thorough description on how this is done. Make sure your tire is well seated before pumping it up to its final pressure. The pressure is labeled on the side of the tire. Make sure and fill the crack on the inside of the bearing race with grease so your bearings never run dry. When standing over the bike, the right side is the drive side of the bike. Make sure that's the side you put the chain ring on. Left side of the bike turns left to tighten. Make sure your bearings are not loose, but they're not binding either. Also, make sure you use a waterproof grease when doing this job. If you need more help or need to see a more in-depth video on rebuilding a one-piece bottom bracket, I do have a video on that. It's called New Life for Old Bikes, Rebuilding a One-Piece Bottom Bracket. Before reinstalling this caliper brake on the back of the bike, I rebuilt it. If you need more information on that, I have a video, New Life for Old Bikes, Rebuilding Caliper Brakes. Go. The original chain on this bike is rusty. It's also stretched. So what I'm doing is measuring it, and then I'm going to cut it to the proper length. This little gizmo here will push the rivet through, and I'll be able to shorten the chain. If you need any more information on replacing a chain, see my video, New Life for Old Bikes, Replacing a Chain. When installing the fork, make sure you're using waterproof grease, just like the rest of the parts. Make sure you fill this gap with plenty of grease. We want to make sure that this bearing never runs dry. I've already installed the bearings in the top cup. A little bit of grease on the stem will prevent it from locking up in the future. At this point, we're going to cut some new cable housing for this. When I say new, we're going to cut some vintage cable housing. This particular cable housing is probably about 50 years old. Should be right about there. Oh yeah, that's going to fit nicely. This is the center piece of cable behind the chain ring in place. I ended up having to trim off the outer housing. The reason for that is it was such a tight fit. I probably should have put that in first before I even put in the bottom bracket. Let's cut the rear cable housing to fit. Looks about right. I want you to notice there's two different shifter cable ends. Make sure you cut off the one you don't need and keep the proper one. In this case, we're going to keep this one. We're putting on just enough grease to prevent the moisture from causing rust on these cables. Before connecting the cable in the back, make sure your shifter is on the lowest gear. Take this beauty out and see how she does. I wanted to thank Charlotte for trusting me with such a prized possession. If you have any questions about this project or any part of the project, let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, like and subscribe.